June 1940. Europe was in flames. The thunder of war rolled across the continent as the German Wehrmacht advanced with a terrifying precision that few believed possible. In Paris, the streets were filled with panicked citizens, their faces etched with fear and disbelief. Families fled with whatever they could carry, children clinging to parents, while soldiers and resistance fighters prepared for the impossible, holding the line against an enemy whose reach seemed endless. Among the chaos, a young British officer, Lieutenant James Hawthorne, found himself assigned to a covert reconnaissance mission in northern France. James had joined the army at 18, driven by a mixture of patriotism and youthful idealism. Now, standing on the outskirts of Lille, he realized that the romantic notions of heroism he once held were far removed from the grim reality before him. The fields lay scarred by artillery fire, and the air carried a metallic tang that clung to his lungs. Each step he took was cautious. Each shadow seemed a potential threat. James was not alone. He was accompanied by Marcel, a local French guide, and a handful of soldiers trained in intelligence gathering. Marcel's knowledge of the countryside and his ability to speak German convincingly made him indispensable. Yet, trust in wartime was a fragile commodity. Every corner of northern France bore the marks of occupation, burned homes, abandoned livestock, and whispers of disappearances. It was a world turned upside down, where a single wrong move could mean death or capture. Their mission was simple in theory: observe German troop movements and report back to London. In practice, it was a nightmare. The closer they moved to the German front, the more perilous their journey became. One evening, as twilight bled across the horizon, they stumbled upon a village eerily silent. Houses were empty, doors ajar, and the wind carried a hollow moan through shattered windows. Marcel explained that the villagers had been deported, taken by the Nazis to labor camps or worse. James felt a chill creep down his spine. The abstract horrors he had heard about in briefings were now horrifyingly tangible. They camped at the edge of a forest, the shadows of the trees their only protection from patrols. Around the campfire, Marcel spoke of the growing French resistance. They are few, he said, but they strike like ghosts. They can disappear before the Germans even know they were here. James listened intently, fascinated and terrified in equal measure. In these moments, the war was no longer about borders or strategies. It was about people, the silent courage of those who resisted, often with nothing but a rifle and sheer willpower. Night fell, and with it came the danger. German patrols moved like ghosts along the dirt roads, their boots crunching softly on the gravel. James and his team held their breath, hearts pounding, as the soldiers passed within yards of their hiding spot. The wind shifted, carrying with it the faint scent of gunpowder and smoke. In that tense silence, James realized how fragile life had become. One mistake, one careless sound, could end it all. Yet, despite the fear, there was also a strange exhilaration. This was the front line, the place where history was being made, and he was a small part of it. Over the next week, the team moved from village to village, collecting intelligence, narrowly avoiding German checkpoints, and witnessing the horrors of occupation. In one small town, they found a group of children huddled in a basement, hiding from soldiers who had taken their parents. James knelt beside them, offering what little comfort he could. Marcel translated their whispered fears. "They think the world has forgotten them," he said. James's chest tightened. The war had become more than just strategy. It was a struggle for survival, for humanity itself. One evening, as they prepared to send a coded message back to London, James noticed a lone figure in the distance. A German officer, separated from his unit, moving toward the forest. Instinct and training took over. James and his team silently positioned themselves, rifles ready, waiting for the right moment. But Marcel shook his head. Wait. Sometimes shadows are more than they seem. They watched as the officer, unaware of their presence, passed by without noticing them. It was a reminder that in war, patience and observation often mattered more than force. By the end of their first month in occupied France, James had seen both the cruelty and the resilience of humanity. He had witnessed families torn apart, cities bombed to rubble, and soldiers, both enemy and ally, falling in ways that made the war feel endless. Yet he had also seen bravery, sacrifice, and the quiet determination of ordinary people to survive and resist. He began to understand that heroism was not always about grand victories. Sometimes it was simply about enduring, helping others, and refusing to surrender to fear. Their final mission in Part 1 took them to a German supply depot on the outskirts of Lille. Intelligence suggested that crucial supplies, including weapons and ammunition, were being stockpiled there for the upcoming German offensive. James's team observed from a hidden ridge, taking careful notes and photographs. Marcel pointed out weak points in the depot's defenses, whispering about the possibility of sabotage. For a brief moment, hope surged through James. Perhaps their small actions could make a difference, could delay the enemy, even if just slightly. As they prepared to leave, a sudden explosion rocked the depot. Smoke and fire erupted into the night sky. James and Marcel exchanged a stunned glance. They had not caused it. Someone else had acted. Someone brave enough to strike at the heart of the German war machine. The sound echoed across the valley, a reminder that resistance, even in the smallest forms, was alive. James felt a mixture of fear and awe. The war was vast, overwhelming, and merciless, but in that darkness, sparks of courage could still shine. Part 1 closes on a note of grim determination. James Hawthorne and his team retreat into the forest, hearts heavy but unbroken. The shadows over Europe were long and dark, but amidst the terror, the human spirit endured. For every act of cruelty, there were acts of defiance. For every fallen soldier, there were those who carried on. The war was far from over, and James knew that the coming months would demand everything from him and his companions. But he was ready, or at least, as ready as anyone could be when facing the unimaginable horrors of the Second World War. July 1940. The war in Europe was intensifying. The German war machine seemed unstoppable, yet pockets of resistance were beginning to emerge across occupied France. Lieutenant James Hawthorne and his small team had retreated into the forests outside Lille after witnessing the explosion at the German supply depot. That night, as they huddled beneath the trees, James realized that survival required more than courage. It required strategy, patience, and alliances. Marcel, ever vigilant, had been in contact with members of the local resistance, a clandestine network of ordinary citizens determined to resist the occupation. They were farmers, teachers, and factory workers, each risking execution for even minor acts of defiance. James had always imagined war as battles between armies, but now he saw another front, a hidden, shadowy struggle where intelligence and cunning mattered more than firepower. The team moved carefully through the countryside, guided by Marcel. Their first task was to establish communication with a resistance cell in a nearby village. Under the cover of night, they reached a seemingly abandoned farmhouse. Inside, they found a group of villagers huddled in secrecy, maps and radios scattered across a wooden table. One elderly man, Henri, looked up and nodded at James. His eyes were weary, yet they held a spark of defiance. "We have been waiting for you," he said quietly. "The Germans are preparing something big." Over the next several days, James and his team coordinated with the villagers, collecting intelligence on troop movements, ammunition depots, and supply lines. Marcel's knowledge of local terrain proved invaluable. He knew hidden paths, old tunnels, and forested hideaways that allowed them to move undetected. Despite the constant fear of discovery, James felt a strange sense of purpose. Each piece of information gathered was a small victory, a subtle pushback against the overwhelming force of the occupiers. One morning, they were tasked with a dangerous reconnaissance mission near a German garrison. James, Marcel, and two soldiers advanced under the cover of fog, moving silently through fields scarred by artillery. From a ridge, they observed the garrison, soldiers patrolling, trucks loaded with supplies, and guards stationed at watchtowers. James documented everything in detail, photographing the layout and memorizing patrol routines. The tension was palpable. One wrong move could cost them their lives. That night, as they returned to the farmhouse. The sound of distant gunfire broke the stillness. A nearby village had been raided. James and Marcel exchanged grim looks. The war was never confined to strategic objectives. It touched civilians indiscriminately. They found several families hiding in cellars, terrified, whispering prayers for survival. James knelt beside a mother clutching her child. Her hands trembled as she spoke. "We have nothing left, yet we must keep going." Her courage, despite devastation, struck James deeply. He realized that heroism was not always about battles. It was about endurance, compassion, and hope in the darkest times. The following weeks were a blur of activity. James's team assisted the resistance in sabotaging small German operations, derailing supply trucks, cutting communication lines, and spreading misinformation. Each act was dangerous, yet necessary. The Germans, efficient and relentless, punished the slightest hint of defiance, yet the courage of ordinary people continued to shine. Marcel often reminded James, "The smallest spark can ignite the largest fire." In the shadows of occupied France, these sparks were beginning to grow into flames. One day, Marcel received word that a German officer, notorious for his brutal reprisals, was passing through the area. The resistance saw an opportunity to strike, a carefully planned ambush that could disrupt the officer's command and send a message of defiance. James and his team prepared meticulously, laying traps and planning escape routes. As night fell, the ambush began. The officer's convoy moved along the forested road, unaware of the danger ahead. Explosions erupted and chaos ensued. The Germans were taken by surprise, and the resistance managed to escape with minimal casualties. The ambush was a turning point for James. He realized that the war was not only about massive battles and strategic maneuvers, but also about courage in the face of overwhelming odds. The resistance's victories, though small in scale, sent ripples of hope throughout the occupied regions. People began to believe that the Germans were not invincible, that even ordinary citizens could make a difference. However, the cost of resistance was ever present. James witnessed families torn apart, neighbors executed, and villages destroyed in retaliation. The moral weight of war pressed heavily on him. He questioned whether their actions were worth the inevitable reprisals. Yet Marcel reminded him that surrendering to fear was far worse. "If we do nothing," Marcel said, "then we are already defeated." By the end of Part 2, James's team had become integral to the resistance network. They had learned to navigate the treacherous landscape of occupied France, balancing stealth, strategy, and courage. James himself had changed. The idealistic officer of June had become a hardened yet compassionate soldier, aware of the immense responsibility that came with the power to act, and the moral complexities that defined every decision in war. The story closed on a somber but determined note. Fires of resistance burned quietly in the villages of northern France. Though the German occupation loomed large, ordinary people were beginning to fight back, risking everything for freedom. James Hawthorne understood that the war ahead would be long and grueling, yet he also knew that the human spirit, when united in courage and resilience, could never be fully extinguished. The flames of defiance, small but relentless, were beginning to light the path toward hope. August 1940. Summer in northern France brought long days and restless nights. For Lieutenant James Hawthorne and his team, there was no respite. Their work with the resistance had intensified. Every movement, every word, every encounter carried the weight of life and death. The Germans were tightening their grip on the countryside, and rumors of spies and traitors circulating among the villages added a new layer of danger. The team had relocated to a small, abandoned mill on the outskirts of a forest near Lille. From there, they could monitor German troop movements and coordinate sabotage missions. Marcel, ever vigilant, noticed subtle changes in the villagers' behavior. Whispers that once carried hope now carried fear. Something was wrong. One evening, as they reviewed maps by candlelight, Marcel pointed to a pattern of failed resistance missions. "The Germans know more than they should," he said quietly. James frowned. Betrayal within the network was a nightmare they could not afford. A single compromised mission could cost dozens of lives. The next morning, a message arrived from a distant village requesting urgent help. A supply convoy carrying food and medicine was being intercepted by German patrols. James's team moved immediately, navigating through hidden paths and dense forests. When they reached the convoy, they discovered the grim truth. It had been a trap. Gunfire erupted from the trees, German soldiers closing in from multiple sides. James and his soldiers returned fire, taking cover behind overturned carts and trees. Amid the chaos, Marcel shouted. Someone tipped them off. James's heart sank. They had been betrayed. The ambush was deadly, but through skill and luck, they managed to escape, retreating to a nearby stream to hide. Breathing heavily, soaked from the river crossing, James realized that trust was fragile in war, and betrayal could appear from the most unexpected places. Back at the mill, the team regrouped. James decided they could not ignore the possibility of a mole within the resistance. He and Marcel devised a plan to uncover the traitor. Disguised as ordinary villagers, they infiltrated the networks, listening to rumors, testing loyalties, and observing reactions. Suspicion and fear grew with each passing day. Every friendly face became a potential enemy. Every whispered conversation a test. Meanwhile, the Germans were increasing their presence in the region. Air raids had begun, the thunder of bombers shaking the forests, and smoke rising from distant towns. James watched from a ridge as buildings burned, their silhouettes stark against the horizon. He could feel the hopelessness pressing down, yet he also sensed the resilience of the people below. Children hid in cellars, families moved in silence, and villagers whispered plans of defiance. The human spirit endured, even in the face of overwhelming fear. It was during one of these reconnaissance missions that James discovered a clue about the traitor. A coded message, carelessly left in a village mailbox, revealed plans that should have remained secret. The handwriting was familiar, someone from within their own ranks. Confrontation was necessary, but dangerous. One wrong accusation, and the traitor could alert the Germans, destroying months of work and costing countless lives. James and Marcel devised a subtle trap. They arranged for sensitive information to be leaked to the supposed mole, tracking its path and observing reactions. Days later, the truth was revealed. One of the local leaders, motivated by fear for his family, had been passing information to the Germans. James felt a surge of anger, tempered by understanding. War forced impossible choices, and sometimes survival led people to betray their own. Yet consequences had to follow. Trust, once broken, could not be restored so easily. With the traitor removed, James's team refocused on their mission. The Resistance's strength lay not in individual heroics, but in unity, coordination, and courage. They began planning a bold operation, sabotage of a key German ammunition depot. Marcel led the reconnaissance, identifying guard rotations, weak points, and escape routes. James knew that failure was not an option. Every life, every mission, carried immense weight. The night of the operation arrived. James and his team moved like shadows through the forest, their rifles silent, their nerves taut. The depot loomed ahead, illuminated by flickering searchlights. Timing was critical. Explosives were placed with precision, guards silently neutralized, and alarms carefully avoided. At the final moment, a spark ignited the fuse. Flames erupted, sending fire and smoke into the sky. The depot exploded with a thunderous roar, visible for miles across the valley. For James, the sight was bittersweet. Victory had come at a cost. Casualties among resistance fighters, homes destroyed in collateral damage, and the knowledge that the Germans would retaliate. Yet it was a symbol. Even in occupied France, ordinary people could strike back. Every small victory fed hope, and hope was a weapon the Germans could never fully control. Part 3 closed with a tense aftermath. James and Marcel, standing atop a ridge, watched the burning depot. The sky glowed orange and red, and the forest below seemed to whisper secrets of courage and survival. The resistance would rebuild, adapt, and continue to fight. Betrayal and danger were ever present, but so were heroism and resilience. James understood now that war was not only measured in victories or losses on a battlefield, but in the perseverance of humanity amidst chaos. As night fell, the team retreated into the forest, shadows merging with darkness. The Germans would hunt them, the traitor had been removed, and new challenges awaited, but the fires of resistance, both literal and figurative, would continue to burn. The fight for freedom was far from over. September 1940. The forests of northern France had become both a sanctuary and a battlefield. Lieutenant James Hawthorne and his team had gained a reputation among the local resistance for their daring missions. But with each act of defiance, the shadow of German retaliation grew larger. The war was no longer an abstract struggle. It had become intensely personal, touching every village, every home, and every life. The resistance had learned from past mistakes. Following the discovery of the traitor in Part 3, they tightened security, implemented stricter protocols, and trained new recruits in the arts of stealth, sabotage, and survival. Marcel had become an invaluable guide, teaching James and the soldiers how to read the land, predict enemy patrols, and use the forest to their advantage. Yet, even the most meticulous plans could be undone by the unpredictable cruelty of war. One early morning, a new mission arrived. Disrupt German communications to delay reinforcements moving toward the coast. The target was a telegraph and radio station in a small town near Lille, heavily guarded by soldiers. James and his team prepared carefully, gathering intelligence from the villagers and coordinating with a local resistance cell. Every step of the plan required precision. Every movement carried the weight of life and death. As night fell, James, Marcel, and two soldiers moved through the forest. The air was thick with tension, the only sounds being the distant rumble of artillery and the rustle of leaves beneath their feet. From a ridge, they observed the town. Searchlights swept across streets. Soldiers patrolled methodically, and armed vehicles guarded the station. The team split into smaller groups to maximize stealth and cover multiple points simultaneously. James and Marcel approached the telegraph station, silently neutralizing guards and cutting communication lines. The town was plunged into darkness as the power was sabotaged, disrupting German coordination across the region. Flames from a small, controlled fire illuminated their determined faces. Nearby, another team intercepted German messages, ensuring the sabotage remained unnoticed until too late. Despite the operation's success, the cost was immediate and stark. The Germans retaliated swiftly. Air raids struck nearby villages, forcing families to flee their homes once more. James witnessed the destruction, the smoke rising like dark clouds over the countryside, and the human suffering caused by a war that seemed to spare no one. Yet, amidst the devastation, the villagers' resilience shone. They rebuilt, hid, and continued to resist. Even in despair, courage persisted. The following days brought news of a German counterintelligence sweep. Patrols intensified, checkpoints multiplied, and whispers of informants spread like wildfire. The resistance knew that survival depended on vigilance, cunning, and trust. James realized that heroism was as much about patience and endurance as it was about daring action. One misstep could undo weeks of careful planning. Amid this tense environment, James and Marcel encountered a group of captured resistance fighters in a hidden cellar. They had been betrayed, tortured, and left to die. James's heart sank. The price of courage was heavy, and the war had a relentless way of punishing even the bravest. Yet he also recognized the unbroken spirit in their eyes. Even weakened, beaten, and starving, these fighters refused to surrender. Their determination inspired James, reinforcing the understanding that heroism was not always measured in victories, but in the refusal to give up. In response to increasing German pressure, James devised a bold plan, a coordinated strike on a convoy transporting weapons and supplies to the front. Using intelligence gathered by Marcel and local villagers, the team set up traps along the convoy's route, cutting trees, positioning explosives, and preparing ambush points. Precision and timing were critical. Hesitation could lead to disaster. The night of the operation arrived. Under a moonless sky, James and his team moved like shadows. The convoy approached, unaware of the danger ahead. Explosions ripped through the forest, vehicles overturned, and German soldiers scrambled in confusion. The team struck quickly and efficiently, disappearing into the forest before reinforcements could arrive. The success sent a powerful message. Even in the heart of occupation, ordinary people could disrupt the machinery of war. But the victory was bittersweet. In the aftermath, James learned that one of the villagers who had helped guide them had been captured. He would likely face torture or execution. The war exacted its toll indiscriminately. James stood at the edge of the forest, watching smoke curl from distant towns and villages, reflecting on the sacrifices made in the pursuit of freedom. Courage came with a price, sometimes paid in blood, sometimes in silence, sometimes in lives cut short. As Part 4 drew to a close, James and Marcel returned to their forest refuge. They were weary, scarred by the realities of war, yet their resolve remained unbroken. The resistance continued to grow, fueled by hope, determination, and the unwavering belief that the fight for freedom was worth every sacrifice. James understood that the war ahead would demand even more: strategic brilliance, unflinching courage, and the ability to endure horrors beyond imagination. The night was silent, but the forest seemed alive with possibility. Fires of resistance burned in the hearts of ordinary people, and every act of defiance, however small, sent a ripple of hope through occupied France. James Hawthorne had seen despair, brutality, and betrayal, but he had also witnessed resilience, bravery, and humanity. The struggle was far from over, but the story of resistance, survival, and courage would continue, one daring act at a time. October 1940. Northern France was a land of shadows and whispered courage. Lieutenant James Hawthorne and his team had become seasoned veterans of the clandestine war against the German occupiers. Months of sabotage, reconnaissance, and survival had transformed them from a small group of soldiers into symbols of hope for the local resistance. Yet with each daring act, the Germans grew more relentless, their reprisals more brutal. James and Marcel convened with resistance leaders in a secluded cellar beneath a ruined farmhouse. Maps covered the walls, showing supply routes, garrison locations, and areas under surveillance. Intelligence suggested that the Germans were planning a major offensive in the region, using a railway line to transport troops and weapons to reinforce the front. James knew that if they failed to disrupt it, countless lives would be lost. This mission, more than any other, carried the weight of destiny. The plan was audacious. They would sabotage the railway, destroy key supply trains, and delay the German advance. Coordination was critical. Resistance cells across multiple villages would act simultaneously to ensure maximum impact. James studied the maps, memorizing every turn, bridge, and tunnel. Marcel reminded him, "The Germans may control the land, but we control the shadows." Every word carried the gravity of the risk they faced. As night fell, James and his team moved silently through the forests. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and distant smoke from burning villages. Patrols were more vigilant than ever, yet they navigated the terrain with the confidence of those who had lived and breathed these forests for months. Every shadow was scanned, every sound analyzed. The line between life and death was thinner than ever. Reaching the railway, they set explosives at critical junctions, hidden among rocks and roots. Marcel signaled to nearby teams, who simultaneously sabotaged trains and communication lines. The explosions echoed across the valley, a symphony of defiance that lit the night sky. Trains derailed, supplies destroyed, and German soldiers scattered in chaos. The mission was a resounding success, a testament to the meticulous planning and bravery of ordinary people risking everything for freedom. But the victory came at a cost. During the operation, James witnessed a fellow resistance fighter fall under enemy fire. The loss was painful, a reminder that heroism carried the ultimate price. Marcel put a steady hand on James's shoulder. "We honor them by continuing. he said. James nodded, knowing that perseverance was the only way forward. In war, grief and courage often existed side by side, inseparable companions on the road to freedom. Returning to the forest, James received news that the Germans had begun retaliatory sweeps, punishing villages suspected of aiding the resistance. Families fled, farms were destroyed, and the shadow of fear loomed larger than ever. Yet amidst the devastation, the people remained unbroken. Villagers helped each other rebuild, hid fugitives, and continued to support acts of resistance. Every small defiance was a victory, every act of courage a spark against tyranny. Over the next weeks, James reflected on the journey from June to October. The idealistic young officer who first arrived in France had been tested, broken, and reforged in the crucible of war. He had seen betrayal, loss, and cruelty, yet he had also witnessed unparalleled bravery, humanity, and hope. Heroism was not always measured in battles won or enemies killed. Sometimes it was the courage to endure, to resist, and to protect others in impossible circumstances. The story of the resistance continued beyond the actions of any single individual. Each person, villager, soldier, guide, contributed to a movement that could not be crushed. James realized that their victories, though small and often unseen, were part of a larger struggle. Each successful mission, each act of defiance, each life spared, sent ripples of hope throughout occupied France. Freedom was not yet won, but the flames of resistance burned brighter than ever. As autumn settled over the countryside, James and his team prepared for the next phase of the war. They knew that challenges lay ahead: harsher winters, more aggressive German patrols, and the ever-present threat of betrayal. Yet they also knew that their actions mattered, that their courage inspired others, and that the human spirit, when united, could withstand even the darkest oppression. Part 5 closes on a note of determination and hope. Standing atop a ridge overlooking the valley, James watched the sun rise over a land scarred by war, but not defeated. Smoke from sabotage fires still lingered in the distance, but the light of dawn cast a golden hue over the forests and villages. For the first time in months, he felt a profound sense of purpose. The war was far from over, but the story of resistance, survival, and courage continued, one daring act at a time. James Hawthorne and his companions knew the cost of defiance, yet they also knew its necessity. The Second World War was a shadow over Europe, but even in that darkness, human courage, resilience, and hope could shine through. And so, the fight continued, the fires of resistance burning quietly, awaiting the day when freedom would finally be reclaimed.